Hello there, and welcome to Dream Past Diaries. I'm truly glad you've made it here. Maybe it's been a long day, or maybe you're the kind of dreamer who prefers to drift off to the sound of quiet thoughts and forgotten mysteries instead of counting sheep. Either way, tonight's story is yours to enjoy. You don't have to do anything now, just rest. Let your thoughts slow, your breath deepen, and your body grow lighter, as if gravity itself has begun to fade away.
In the quiet, unhurried centuries before conflict announced itself loudly in cannon smoke and treaties written in foreign ink, the Qing Empire existed as a vast, methodical organism that breathed according to rhythms older than memory, where the mornings in Beijing began with the soft scraping of broom whistles across stone courtyards, where clerks in long robes unfolded their desks with the same careful precision every day, dipping brushes into inkstones worn smooth by generations of hands, and where the idea of change moved as slowly as a barge drifting along the Grand Canal, carrying grain, silk, salt, and paperwork from south to north in a patient procession that seemed eternal. This was an empire that believed deeply in order, not as an abstract concept, but as a daily habit, present in the way officials bowed at exact angles, in the way bells marked time at city gates, and in the way families arranged their ancestral tablets in careful rows, believing stability itself was a moral achievement. And within this calm administrative universe, the outside world existed mostly as a distant curiosity, a place of tribute missions, controlled ports, and occasional reports read aloud in low voices within echoing halls, where foreign traders were spoken of less as individuals and more as categories, described in measured language that reduced oceans and continents into manageable lines of text, while tea leaves dried in the sun, porcelain cooled in kilns, and farmers followed agricultural calendars that had barely changed since the Han Dynasty. Yet beneath this surface calm, unnoticed at first, there was the gentle arrival of a substance that would slowly unbalance this long-standing equilibrium, arriving not as an invasion, but as a habit, introduced quietly through coastal trade, passing from shipholds into warehouses, from warehouses into private rooms where lamps burned low and conversations grew slower. And the empire, accustomed to thinking in centuries, did not immediately sense danger in something that appeared so small, so personal, and so easily ignored. Daily life continued with reassuring sameness as the opium trade expanded in invisibility, with scholars rising before dawn to recite classical passages, their voices murmuring through cold air as they prepared for examinations that tested memory more than imagination, while merchants balanced accounts using counting rods on lacquered tables, pausing often for tea, and laborers moved earth and stone with practiced patience, each action performed as if it had been rehearsed across generations. And in these routines, opium appeared not as disruption, but as quiet accompaniment, something consumed indoors, away from the formal spaces of ritual and governance, where officials still believed morality could be enforced through edicts and self-discipline, and where addiction was seen less as a structural threat and more as an individual failing, a moral softness that Confucian teachings would surely correct in time. The imperial bureaucracy, immense and layered, moved slowly by design, its documents passing through many hands, each adding seals and commentary, ensuring deliberation over urgency. And so early warnings were softened by language, diluted by politeness, and often postponed for future consideration, while foreign traders, particularly those operating through British commercial interests, observed this slowness with careful attention, understanding that patience, not confrontation, would yield profit. And so ships returned again and again, unloading silver and loading tea, while also quietly redistributing opium grown far away in India, its origins distant enough to feel abstract, its effects gradual enough to feel tolerable, at least at first. Emotionally, the empire existed in a state of dignified confidence, a belief that China, as the Middle Kingdom, sat naturally at the center of civilization, not needing to hurry or adapt, because others would eventually adjust themselves to its systems. And this confidence made it difficult to perceive economic imbalance when silver began flowing outward more rapidly than before, draining reserves slowly but steadily, like water seeping through unseen cracks in a dam. And while some officials noted the imbalance in memorials written with cautious language, these documents often concluded with reassurances that traditional virtues would restore harmony. And so daily life remained focused on continuity rather than alarm, with families arranging marriages, recording genealogies, and maintaining household rituals, even as more individuals found their evenings stretching longer, their concentration dulling, their routines quietly shifting around a substance that numbed time itself, creating a strange contradiction in an empire built on schedules and calendars, where time now softened and blurred in private rooms filled with smoke and stillness. Culturally, the Qing world prized restraint, repetition, and balance, valuing the slow accumulation of wisdom over sudden innovation. And this cultural preference made the creeping influence of opium particularly insidious, because it mirrored the empire's own pace, advancing gradually, politely, without dramatic rupture. And so the destruction of stability did not announce itself through chaos, but through subtle erosion, visible only to those who studied patterns closely, noticing how productivity declined in small increments, how discipline weakened quietly, and how enforcement of laws grew inconsistent as those tasked with maintaining order sometimes struggled privately with the same habits they were meant to control. And in this way, the empire's greatest strength, its faith in routine and moral continuity, became a vulnerability, allowing a foreign-driven economic pressure to entangle itself with domestic weakness, all while daily life continued with ceremonial calm, bells still rang, brushstrokes still flowed across paper, and the illusion of permanence remained soothingly intact, even as the foundations of that permanence began, imperceptibly, to give way. As the decades passed with their familiar procession of seasons and ceremonies, the presence of opium settled more deeply into the unnoticed corners of Qing society, weaving itself into the quiet spaces between duty and rest, where evenings stretched long after official responsibilities ended, and where the strict formalities of the daytime world softened into private rituals that no memorial or report could fully capture. And it was in these spaces, behind carved wooden screens, beneath hanging scrolls depicting mountains unchanged for centuries, that the habit grew from occasional indulgence into routine, altering not only individual bodies, but the subtle emotional texture of daily life, as conversations slowed, silences lengthened, and the steady attentiveness once prized by Confucian teaching gently dissolved into a haze that made discipline feel heavy and intention feel distant. The empire, built on the belief that moral cultivation began within the self and radiated outward to family, community, and state, found itself confronting a problem that quietly reversed this flow, drawing energy inward and leaving outward responsibilities increasingly neglected, though rarely abandoned outright, so that work continued but with softened edges, less urgency, and a growing tolerance for delay that mirrored the drug's effect on time itself. In administrative offices, clerks continued to arrive at their desks, unrolling documents and copying figures with the same careful handwriting taught since childhood, yet the rhythm of work shifted subtly, pauses lengthening between tasks, and the once crisp exchanges of instruction becoming slower and more repetitive, as if the bureaucracy itself had begun to inhale and exhale at a different pace. And while official reports still spoke of order and continuity, the lived experience within these offices reflected a gradual thinning of focus that no single person could be blamed for, because it was shared quietly and widely, and thus difficult to isolate or confront. Beyond the walls of governance, in market towns and port cities, the effects were equally gentle yet persistent, as shopkeepers opened their stalls at the usual hour, arranged goods with practiced hands, and greeted familiar customers, yet found themselves lingering longer over simple tasks, their sense of urgency dulled, their profits slipping not through dramatic loss, but through accumulated inattention, small miscalculations, and a growing reliance on credit that mirrored the empire's own financial drift, where silver continued to leave the country in steady streams, exchanged for a substance that produced no lasting value, only temporary calm. Culturally, opium smoking developed its own quiet etiquette, blending seamlessly into existing traditions of refinement and leisure, with carefully prepared pipes, measured movements, and an atmosphere of controlled stillness that appealed to the elite's preference for moderation and elegance, making it easier to rationalize the habit as a form of cultured repose rather than dangerous excess. And this aestheticization further obscured the harm, as beauty and ritual softened perception, allowing the drug to appear compatible with scholarly life and artistic contemplation, even as it subtly eroded the very clarity required for those pursuits. Emotionally, families adjusted without fully understanding what they were adjusting to, noticing loved ones becoming more withdrawn, less present, yet not overtly disruptive. And because harmony was valued above confrontation, these changes were often met with patience rather than alarm, reinforcing a cycle of quiet acceptance that allowed dependency to deepen unchallenged. By the time awareness of the opium problem reached a level that could no longer be softened entirely by elegant language or postponed by ritual caution, the Qing Empire had already absorbed the substance into the texture of its everyday existence, and this made any attempt at reversal feel not only difficult, but strangely disruptive, as if officials were being asked to interrupt a rhythm that had already been internalized by households, markets, and even administrative practice. And so the debates that unfolded within the imperial court were marked by slowness and restraint, conducted through memorials written in carefully balanced prose that weighed moral obligation against economic consequence, each sentence shaped to avoid offense. Each recommendation cushioned our respect for precedent, resulting in a process that felt contemplative rather than urgent, even as the situation quietly worsened. The emperor, surrounded by layers of advisors and ritualized procedure, received these documents as part of a continuous flow of information that described the empire as a living system requiring balance. And within this framework, opium was framed not as an external assault, but as an internal imbalance, something to be corrected through gradual reform rather than forceful confrontation. In provincial administrations, the practical realities of enforcement revealed the gap between policy and lived experience, as local officials were tasked with controlling a trade that was both profitable and deeply embedded, requiring them to police communities they depended on for cooperation and tax revenue. And this created a pervasive atmosphere of quiet compromise, where regulations existed in theory but were selectively applied in practice, and where moral condemnation coexisted with private tolerance, as officials themselves navigated personal habits and social expectations that made strict enforcement emotionally and socially costly. Daily life in these regions continued with a sense of subdued normality, farmers tending fields according to seasonal cycles, artisans repeating familiar motions in workshops scented with wood and oil, and families gathering for meals where conversation flowed gently, often circling the same topics again and again, reinforcing a sense of continuity that made the underlying strain easy to ignore. The emotional climate of the empire during this period was not one of panic, but of fatigue, a collective weariness that settled over routines without fully interrupting them, as if the empire were growing older, its movements slower, its reactions less decisive. And this fatigue was mirrored in the physical experience of opium itself, which offered relief from effort and responsibility, reinforcing passivity at a time when adaptation and vigilance were increasingly necessary. Culturally, this passivity was rationalized through familiar concepts of endurance and harmony, with suffering framed as temporary and imbalance as something that would naturally resolve if not agitated. And so the idea of decisive change felt almost impolite, an unnecessary disturbance of an order that still appeared outwardly intact. Foreign powers, observing from beyond the empire's borders, interpreted this passivity differently, seeing not wisdom but vulnerability. And while their interactions with China remained framed by trade and diplomacy, the imbalance of power grew more apparent as Western commercial and military systems operated on timelines and incentives that favored speed, expansion, and enforcement, creating a contrast that the Qing court struggled to fully grasp, accustomed as it was to a worldview in which cultural authority outweighed material force. Yet even as tensions slowly accumulated, the daily emotional experience of most subjects remained muted and repetitive, shaped more by household concerns than by international dynamics, as people focused on maintaining stability within their immediate surroundings, unaware that the larger structure supporting that stability was under increasing pressure. This chapter of decline unfolded not as a dramatic turning point, but as an extended plateau where warning signs were acknowledged but rarely acted upon with sufficient force, and where the opium trade continued to drain economic and moral resources in a steady, predictable manner, reinforcing patterns of dependency and delay that made future crises more likely. And as nights fell and lamps were lit across cities and villages, the soft glow illuminating familiar spaces, the empire continued to move forward in time without truly moving forward in purpose, carrying with it the weight of tradition, habit, and an increasingly entrenched reliance on a substance that dulled awareness while quietly reshaping the destiny of one of the world's oldest civilizations. As the long accumulation of compromise, fatigue, and quiet tolerance continued to settle over the Qing Empire, the consequences of the opium trade began to express themselves less through moral debate and more through the subtle reshaping of economic life, where numbers recorded in account books told a story of gradual depletion rather than sudden loss, and where movement of silver, once a reassuring indicator of stability, became a quiet source of concern that few fully understood, but many vaguely sensed, as prices fluctuated gently, wages lost consistency, and households adjusted their expectations downward without ever naming the cause, accepting smaller margins and slower progress as part of an unspoken new normal. This economic softening blended seamlessly into daily routines, with merchants opening their shops a little later, closing them a little earlier, and lingering longer in conversation with customers, while artisans repeated familiar techniques without innovation, content to maintain rather than expand, and farmers, bound to the rhythms of land and weather, absorbed these shifts with stoic patience, trusting that endurance, rather than adaptation, remained the proper response to uncertainty. In the countryside, the presence of opium was less visible, but no less influential, as it traveled along the same networks as grain, cloth, and information, reaching villages through informal channels that defied simple regulation. And while its use remained more limited than in urban centers, its economic effects were felt through the broader system of exchange, as silver scarcity made prices feel heavier, wages more persistent, and households adjusted their expectations downward without ever naming the cause, accepting smaller margins and slower progress as part of an unspoken new normal. This economic softening blended seamlessly into daily routines, with merchants opening their shops a little later, closing them a little earlier, and lingering longer in conversation with customers, while artisans repeated familiar techniques without innovation, content to maintain rather than expand, and farmers, bound to the rhythms of land and weather, absorbed these shifts with stoic patience, trusting that endurance, rather than adaptation, remained the proper response to uncertainty. In the Imperial court, discussions of reform continued to circulate, yet they remained framed by caution and respect for precedent, with proposals often diluted by the need to balance competing interests and avoid disruption, resulting in measures that felt more like gestures than solutions. And while some officials recognized the connection between opium, economic imbalance, and declining administrative effectiveness, their voices were softened by the very system they sought to influence, a system designed to preserve stability above all else, even at the cost of gradual decay. Foreign trade, meanwhile, continued to operate with increasing efficiency, driven by external forces that did not share the empire's patience, further exacerbating the imbalance between a world accelerating outward and a civilization choosing to slow inward. The slow erosion of confidence during this era did not manifest as despair, but as a narrowing of ambition, a collective turning inward that favored preservation over progress. And as nights passed and households settled into familiar patterns of rest, the empire drifted further into a state of subdued continuity, maintaining the appearance of order while losing the dynamism that had once sustained it. And in this quiet drift, the opium trade continued its work not as a dramatic agent of destruction, but as a persistent influence that reshaped time, effort, and expectation, preparing the ground for changes that would later appear sudden, but which in truth had been forming slowly, patiently, and almost invisibly for years. With the passage of time continuing its unhurried flow, the Qing Empire entered a phase in which the effects of long-standing imbalance began to feel institutional rather than incidental, as if the quiet adjustments made by individuals and households had been absorbed into the very structure of governance, education, and social expectation, creating a society that still functioned but did so with a softened sense of purpose, where the ambition to improve systems gradually gave way to the desire to maintain them. And this shift was reflected in the routines of official life, where examinations were still administered with ritual precision, candidates still memorized classical texts with devotion, and success was still celebrated within families. Yet the connection between scholarly achievement and effective governance felt increasingly abstract, as those who entered office found themselves constrained by habits of delay and compromise that had become normalized over decades of cautious administration. Within cities, the physical landscape mirrored this emotional stasis, as streets remained familiar and orderly, shops displayed the same goods year after year, and buildings aged gently without significant renovation, conveying a sense of endurance rather than renewal. And while this continuity was often praised as stability, it also masked a growing reluctance to invest energy in change, reinforcing a cultural environment in which opium's quiet promise of rest and detachment felt emotionally appropriate, aligning with a collective inclination toward stillness that made exertion feel unnecessary and even undesirable. Families, observing these patterns, adapted by emphasizing contentment over aspiration, teaching children to value modest comfort and obedience, preparing them for lives defined more by repetition than by transformation. Emotionally, this era fostered a subdued introspection, where individuals turned inward for reassurance rather than outward for opportunity, and opium use, now thoroughly embedded in certain social circles, served as both symptom and reinforcement of this inward turn, offering moments of calm that blended seamlessly into evenings already shaped by familiarity and routine. And because these moments rarely disrupted outward appearances, they were tolerated as private matters, reinforcing a social norm that prioritized surface harmony over deeper inquiry, making it difficult to confront the cumulative consequences of widespread disengagement. At the imperial level, attempts to address the opium issue continued to emerge, yet they remained fragmented and cautious, reflecting the broader institutional reluctance to impose strict measures that might disturb social equilibrium. And while some officials advocated stronger enforcement or economic restructuring, their proposals were often softened through debate, resulting in policies that acknowledged the problem without fully committing to its resolution. And this pattern of partial response mirrored the empire's broader struggle to adapt to a changing world, where external pressures demanded clarity and decisiveness, while internal culture favored patience and moderation. Foreign presence along the coast grew more assertive during this time, not through overt confrontation, but through steady expansion of trade infrastructure and influence, introducing rhythms of commerce that contrasted sharply with the empire's measured pace. And although these developments were noted in official records, they were often framed as manageable challenges rather than transformative threats, reinforcing a sense of complacency that allowed external forces to gain leverage incrementally without triggering a corresponding internal mobilization. As daily life continued under these conditions, the emotional texture of the empire settled into a state of quiet acceptance, where decline was experienced not as loss, but as normalcy, and where the opium trade, rather than shocking the system, blended into its rhythms, contributing to a long, gentle descent that felt calm from within, even as it gradually undermined the resilience that had once defined one of history's most enduring empires. As the subtle pressures of the opium trade continued to permeate society, the Qing Empire moved further into a period where routine and ritual dominated perception and practice, creating a world in which continuity was prized above innovation, and in which the rhythms of daily life, though superficially unchanged, had already begun to adjust to accommodate the quiet compromises imposed by economic and moral strain, so that evenings were spent in repetitive patterns of consumption and contemplation, mornings opened with familiar motions repeated across generations, and the formalities of government, education, and family life proceeded with ceremonial precision that masked underlying fatigue and adaptation, all of which contributed to an illusion of stability even as subtle decay advanced slowly but relentlessly. Officials continued to receive memorials detailing concerns over trade imbalance and opium use, but these were often written in soft, cautious language, emphasizing moral admonishment rather than practical enforcement, and were filtered through layers of bureaucratic consideration that further delayed decisive action, ensuring that the empire's response remained tempered, indirect, and ultimately insufficient. In households across cities and towns, daily life followed well-worn scripts. Children were instructed in basic literacy, calligraphy, and moral lessons, often repeating lessons multiple times under the watchful gaze of elders, while meals were prepared with meticulous care, balancing taste, propriety, and ritual. Yet within these patterns, the subtle effects of opium could be observed in the softening of attentiveness, the lengthening of pauses in conversation, and the gentle drift of emotional energy toward quiet contentment rather than engagement with pressing problems. Artisans continued to produce wares, their hands steady but their ambitions muted, while merchants and shopkeepers maintained accounts with careful regularity, yet tolerated small delays in transactions and minor inconsistencies in weight or measure, an accommodation that reflected a broader societal tolerance for gradual imperfection, and which mirrored the more abstract tolerances seen at higher administrative levels. Culturally, the continued prevalence of opium reinforced patterns of introspection and aesthetic appreciation, aligning with the empire's long-standing emphasis on personal cultivation, harmony, and endurance, so that the presence of the substance could be framed as compatible with scholarly reflection, artistic pursuit, and spiritual moderation, even while it eroded productivity, drained economic reserves, and dulled the sense of urgency required to navigate an increasingly complex international environment. And this alignment between habit and cultural values made critique more difficult, as it required questioning not only an external trade, but also internal assumptions about balance, propriety, and the appropriate pace of life. Meanwhile, on the coasts, foreign merchants continued to operate within a framework of efficiency and predictability that contrasted sharply with the internal pace of the Qing administration, arriving and departing with precision, maintaining meticulous accounts, and steadily expanding networks of influence. Yet these movements, though noticed by officials, were framed in reports as manageable phenomena, requiring careful negotiation and subtle diplomacy rather than dramatic intervention, reinforcing a perception that external pressures were abstract, negotiable, and ultimately subordinate to the empire's enduring moral and cultural authority, even as these external systems gained leverage. At the imperial level, discussions of reform remained ongoing, but were increasingly cautious, structured around advisory councils, ceremonial review, and layered recommendation, producing edicts that were often more symbolic than effective, reflecting a broader institutional preference for preserving harmony over imposing disruption, and thereby allowing existing patterns of consumption, tolerance, and economic leakage to continue largely unchecked, a slow erosion conducted not with confrontation but with polite omission, gentle delay, and procedural rigor. In this period, the emotional tenor of daily life became increasingly characterized by repetition, acceptance, and subdued reflection, where the future was imagined in terms of continuation rather than transformation, and where the opium trade operated not as a violent agent of destruction, but as a softening, calming influence, integrating seamlessly with established practices, routines, and expectations, reinforcing the very patience, moderation, and endurance that had long been valued as virtues, while simultaneously dulling the awareness that might have prompted decisive intervention. Thus, the empire persisted in its familiar rhythms, achieving an appearance of order while internal resilience quietly diminished.